Hello, good evening and welcome to this edition of the program. You caught me tying up my buttons. Thank you very much. And tonight I want you to sit back and enjoy this interview because you see, I think that Africa is really going somewhere. I think that a new leadership of Africa is going to be great. I think that the problem of Africa is being decoded from across the continent. Many different politicians are rising up. And I've encountered Honourable Makhosini Hlongwane. He's a member of parliament in Zimbabwe, and I want to speak with him tonight about the political and economic recovery of Zimbabwe. You should hear his optimism about Zimbabwe, and then you will understand. We'll talk broadly about his country, about the upcoming elections in his country with a new constitution that should hopefully end all the crises of Zimbabwe over the last 10 years, political and leadership crisis that Zimbabwe have had in relation to their relationship, of course, with the global authorities. We'll speak a bit about Kenya and what happened in Nairobi. The last Tuesday, we talked a bit about the Nairobi court's ruling that has now endorsed Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto as president and vice president of Zimbabwe. You know that William Ruto was on this show a few months before the election. We'll bring back that one. He was optimistic that he will join Uhuru and that they were going to win the election. So being interviewed on Good Evening Ghana as an international politician may propel you to become president or vice president of your country. On that note, I welcome you, Honourable Makhosini. William Ruto sat in that chair that you're sitting in, and he's going to be vice president soon of Kenya.
Thank you very much, Paul, for having me. Notwithstanding the fact I must state from the outset, I have no ambitions of being president or vice president of Zimbabwe.
I think that you have this great vision and you talk like a young African leader who believes that things can happen, and you are particularly optimistic about Zimbabwe. What's the situation right now in terms of the recovery politically and economically?
Oh, well, it's, the situation in Zimbabwe has improved in a big way. From an economic point of view, let's start from there. We went through a big meltdown in 2007 and 2008, where our currency virtually collapsed. We believe because of the economic sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by Europe and by the United States, our currency did not have any defenses, and therefore it gave in immediately after how many years? 5 years from 2001, so 7 years. It gave in after about 7 years. Because what the sanctions meant is that we now ate into our reserves because we couldn't export to most of our traditional markets that we used to export to. That is the situation as obtaining as of 2008. The government immediately introduced a multi-currency regime to deal with the hyperinflation, with our currency going into millions, trillions, with $1 trillion note, for instance, with $1 billion note, and so forth. But now inflation has been brought down to below 4% for a very long and sustained period, since 2009 up to present moment. That's as far as the area of the economy is concerned. I must mention from the outset again that as far as improving productive capacity of our industrial base is concerned, that is improving, but slowly. It is improving but slowly because of the political problems that we have in the country, emanating from the fact that we have a government which is consummated by 3 political parties which are always working at variance with one another.
You have 3 main political parties in Zimbabwe?
Three political parties.
Tell us a bit about them.
ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party, and then which is the part of the President Robert Mugabe. And then we have Mberengwa East party, which is the MDC-T. It's a party with a surname, which is his surname. And then, of course, you have the MDC, which is led by Professor Mugabe. These 3 political parties came together to form the government of the Republic of Zimbabwe as of February 13, 2009.
Okay, so these are the 3 political arrangements in Zimbabwe.
Yes.
What are the key elements in the new constitution?
Well, it's a very exciting constitution in more ways than one. Key among them is the fact that Chapter 4 of the Constitution, for instance, has a Bill of Rights which cannot be changed by an act of parliament, cannot be changed by any sitting president, cannot be changed by any government, except they have to go to a referendum and win that referendum by 2/3 in order to alter the Bill of Rights as it is. Beyond that, and most importantly, is Chapter 16, which speaks to the issue of land reform in Zimbabwe, the realignment of property relations. You know that in Zimbabwe, we led by the president, we took back land from the minority settler, erstwhile colonizers, and gave it back to the native Zimbabweans. We had 4,000 white people owning 80% of productive land in Zimbabwe. That has been realigned. And what Chapter 16 of the Constitution speaks to is that it's an entrenched chapter. It cannot be changed by an individual. It cannot be changed by a sitting president. One has to go to a referendum in order to...
What are the provisions of this land reform? What does it say?
The most important thing is that there's no reversibility of the land reform as it occurred. In other words, the status quo as it stays, as it is now, as it obtains now on the ground, is maintained and protected by the Constitution. The fact that close to 500,000 households benefited from the land reallocation system that was brought about by the president and his government in 2000. And the few or 4,000 settlers were booted out of most of that productive land. So that realignment of property relations is protected by the Constitution. In other words, any other government that comes in cannot reverse that process. If one has to do that, they have to go to a referendum and end 2/3 in order to be able to do that.
What are some of the other key elements in terms of power sharing, in terms of checks and balances, separation of powers between the legislature, the judiciary, and the presidency, the executive? What are the elements?
I cannot be specific about the elements, but suffice to say that the Constitution speaks clearly about the separation of powers. Even the current Constitution, the Lancaster House Constitution that we are replacing, speaks clearly about the separation of powers. That the executive operates in its own domain, it does its own thing. Same as the judiciary, there is not supposed to be any interference within the juridical processes within the country. And same as the legislature, nobody is supposed to interfere with the process of parliament. The work that we do complements what the judiciary does, complements what the executive does, but there's no interference, undue interference in the work of one to the other.
What about the term limits? What term limits are in the Constitution?
Yes, the new Constitution brings about term limits for the president. Now a president is supposed to serve a maximum of 2 5-year terms. Beyond which he cannot continue to stand unless they are in violation of the new Constitution. For members of parliament, it's open-ended, but a term for each member of parliament is 5 years, and then you go to an election. If you get a legitimate mandate, you proceed with the next term.
When you're going to election in Zimbabwe, do you do what we do in Ghana, the primaries, where the key political parties select their people in a sort of minor election in the constituency? Do you do that?
Yes, that's part of the internal democratic processes within my party, at least. We are going to be having primaries held throughout the country in the next few weeks. We don't have the dates yet. This is a process of arriving at which candidate is going to be representing my party in the general election, contesting the other political parties. So that's what we do.
So how's the general feeling about the people in Zimbabwe and, going into the next election? Is it a competitive election that we're looking at?
Yes, it is indeed a competitive election. You must understand that we're coming out of the context of 2008, which was a very close election. Where ZANU-PF won in parliament, notwithstanding the fact that the Western media put it across as if ZANU-PF lost. You see, Zimbabwe has 2 chambers in parliament. We have a bicameral parliament. We have the Senate and we have the House of Assembly. The House of Assembly, ZANU-PF was defeated 100 to 98. In the Senate...
100 to 98, yes, by 2? By 2.
In the Senate, ZANU-PF won with a margin of 6 seats, that is 30 to 24. So when you combine these parliamentary seats together, you get a majority of ZANU-PF, but it's slim. Now, the mood within the country going forward is that of buoyancy, is that of bullishness. at least on the part of my party, that we are going to win this election resoundingly, thanks to the mistakes of the opposition in the last 4 or 5 years, thanks to the mistakes in the areas that they are running, like the municipal authorities in Harare, Bulawayo, and several other local authorities, where service provision has tremendously declined as a result of their administration.
In Zimbabwe, when you run elections, do you have rallies, huge rallies attended by 10,000, 5,000, 20,000 people?
Yes, we do.
Do you have giant billboards? Do you spend money on that? I have some of your T-shirts, so I know that, yes, there's some T-shirts.
Yes.
You spend quite a bit of money?
Correct. A lot of money, not just a bit of money. Electioneering in Zimbabwe is very expensive. The idea of raising awareness, public awareness, in order for your party to be visible, for your party to be understood, for your brand to be consumed by the public, is something that caught up with Zimbabwean politics a long time ago. So as going forward in the next few weeks, we are going to be seeing giant billboards erected all over cities, along highways, posters, stuck on trees, buildings, etc., and T-shirts for most of the candidates, whether parliamentary, senatorial, presidential. Most of them do T-shirts in order to promote their brand.
The Southern African politics, apart from maybe Angola, is that part of SADC Angola?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
It has not been significantly ravaged by civil wars, military coup d'etats, as you would have, say, in West Africa.
Correct.
As you travel around as a parliamentarian in Zimbabwe, what kind of difference do you see in the effects that these two outcomes have had on the development of the two groups of people, West Africa and Southern Africa?
Okay, part of the challenge I see in West Africa is the specter of political coups intervening in democratic development processes. In my view, I think that has taken back the African continent several decades, wherein people don't respect the rule of law, wherein they don't respect the constitutional order, wherein they don't respect the constitutional means of, peaceful transfer of power, and decide that if they are not happy with a particular individual sitting as president, they'll come in with guns and remove them. We have a situation in Central African Republic recently that has removed the president of that country. That is very unfortunate. I think what it does is that it has a negative impact in terms of the course of development. It has a negative impact in terms of the social, cultural, economic, and even political evolution of that particular society. In Southern Africa, which has been very stable as far as that area is concerned, you see a much more evolved political development process. You see a much more developed infrastructure base, for instance, as far as the economies are concerned. You look at Botswana, you look at South Africa, you look even at Zimbabwe, notwithstanding the fact that the last 10 years have really been difficult on the back of a biting economic sanctions.
So what are the expectations of the people after the election?
Right.
Does the president or the presidential candidate go in with a running mate, as we do in Ghana? You go with a running mate who then is elected vice president when you are elected as president. Do you have that arrangement? We don't. We have provided for that arrangement in the new constitution, but it's only going to take effect in the next 10 years. So the next 2 terms is not going to come into effect. But to your question most specifically is, what are the expectations of the people of Zimbabwe? The people of Zimbabwe want service provision. They want to see a renewed sense of vigor in terms of moving forward with the development manifesto that we saw in the immediate post-independence period. So, and you know that Zimbabwe is endowed with a rich mineral resource base. We have overcome the challenges of the Kimberley process as far as our diamond mining is concerned. We have a good mineral resource in terms of our platinum. We have a good base in terms of our gold. So a new government that is coming to take over after this coming election, which I have no doubt is the government of ZANU-PF, is going to have to put order in the mining sector in Zimbabwe, which the minister has done so very well. He has been working hard under difficult circumstances. But put order to manage the asset, the mining asset in Zimbabwe, and make sure that there's dividend that comes out of the exploitation and extraction of our mineral resources in Zimbabwe for the benefit of the general population, in terms of improving our education system, provision of textbooks and so on, in terms of making sure that our road infrastructure is back to where it used to be more than 10 years ago, in terms of making sure that
hunger is fought in a very vigorous way. These are the things that the Zimbabwean people are expecting. Employment creation. It means that we have to improve capacity in terms of our industrial base. Our manufacturing sector is very robust, but it needs to be worked on with a huge, injection of capital into it so that it picks back again.
After the break, I'd like us to still talk about international politics, and we'll be talking about the situation in Kenya, Nairobi, and the world was unnerved when the elections of Kenya were approaching, given what had happened in 2007 relating to the violence after the election. The election ended, and Mr. Raila Odinga, who is Prime Minister, challenged the results in court. The court has ruled and endorsed the victory, as it were, of Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto. They will be two of the youngest pair of African leaders going forward once they are inaugurated. After the election, after the break, we'll spend some time to talk about Nairobi, Kenya. We'll take a break with Honourable Makhosini. He's from ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. He's visiting with us, and we're just engaging him about the political and economic recovery of his country, Zimbabwe. We'll be right back. Thank you for your time and welcome back to Good Evening Ghana. We are talking African politics today, and we are focusing on Zimbabwe. If you just joined us, Honourable Makhosini is a member of parliament in the Zimbabwean parliament, and he's with the ZANU-PF party, the party of Robert Mugabe. Thank you very much, Honourable, for staying with us. And we're talking about the political and economic recovery of your country. There have been some difficult moments, really, and one of those difficult moments is the question of land reform.
Yes.
That a policy developed by Robert Mugabe directed that white farmers who were themselves citizens of Zimbabwe, because they had been there before independence, were bundled out of your country. And some of them were maimed, some were killed, and their land has been given to local farmers at the whims and caprices of Robert Mugabe. That surely was a low point in the political history of Zimbabwe, and I know it's a very sensitive matter for all Zimbabweans and really for all British and others who were involved in Zimbabwe. What's your take on that matter?
Thank you for that question. It is important first and foremost to understand the context, the historical context leading to the happenings of 2099. It is important to understand how land was taken away from the blacks in Zimbabwe by the settler farmers, the ones that ended up controlling 80% of productive land, and yet they were less than 1% of the total population of Zimbabwe. First and foremost, that is definitely not a sustainable social policy. That is not a sustainable land reform policy. To say less than 1% of a total population of a country controls more than 80% of productive land. It's not sustainable.
When you say controls, you mean they owned it?
Yes, they owned it.
It was for them?
Yes. They
bought it from somebody?
Sorry?
They bought it from somebody as a birthright? How did they own it?
They stole it from Zimbabweans.
Stole?
Yes. When whites came into Zimbabwe, one of the things they set out to do immediately upon landing in Zimbabwe was to remove black people from productive land and resettling them in their own land reform program of that time in the early 1900s, resettling the black people in areas that are not productive with tired soils and cramming them in reserves. The huge black population being crammed together in smallholder lots or smallholder farms. And they took control of vast tracts of land that is productive for ranching, for cattle production, for crop production, and so forth. Most of it to the benefit of themselves, and exporting some of the produce to England. This was the policy then. Now, President Robert Mugabe and his government never intended to take the land in the manner that it turned out in 1999 and 2000. There was an agreement that the land would be bought away from the farmers, but who was going to finance the process of buying away land from white farmers in order to resettle black people? the British government in the discussions that led to independence in 1979 accepted to fund the land reform policy on what is called a willing buyer, willing seller basis. In fact, including the US, they also did accede to the fact that they would fund the land reform program. When the Labour government, led by Tony Blair, came into effect in 2007, 1997, there was a conference to deal with realigning property relations as far as land in Zimbabwe is concerned in 1998. And Britain reneged on its promise. In fact, a minister called Claire Short wrote and said they were not going to be held accountable for the obligations of their ancestors. Therefore, they were not going to pay. So whatever agreement was made between the government of Zimbabwe and then the then government of Margaret Thatcher was not going to be respected. And once that happened...
Was there really an agreement? Was there?
Yes, there was an agreement.
Between Zimbabwe and the government of Margaret Thatcher?
Correct.
What was the agreement called? Do you know?
Well, during the discussions of Lancaster, which led to the current constitution that we're using in Zimbabwe, the key issue, which almost broke down the talks, was the issue around land in Zimbabwe, how land was going to be distributed. Because remember, the reason of going to war in order to liberate Zimbabwe was not to liberate only the people, was to liberate the land, so that land would go back to the black majority in Zimbabwe. And that was a key point until the British government considered that they were going to come in and fund the land reform program with the assistance of the Americans. When the pronouncement was made by Claire Short that this was not going to happen, you can understand what happened in Zimbabwe, how it affected national sentiment, how it affected the national psyche in terms of the blacks having knowing that they had stayed for so long without their land, and suddenly they are not going to be facilitated onto their land. Demonstrations went on. Black people moved onto white-owned farms, and the president famously said that he was not going to set police to arrest fellow black Zimbabweans who were reclaiming their land, simply because the British have reneged on their promise to fund the land reform program. So it really wasn't a low point. The violence that obtained during the process is regrettable. It's not something that anybody would want to see, but this was a national process. It was happening at the same time throughout the country, where land was being taken away from
Now, by what process did they take away these lands? Because the white farmers are sitting on maybe a 2-acre, 3-acre sort of land, and he has his family and his security. By what process were they taking it away? They go and beat him up, which is what was reported, really. Okay,
let me explain first that there's no white farmer who was owning 2 acres or 3 acres. We're talking of over 5,000 hectares of land per person. We're talking of more than 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 properties per person. In fact, initially, the government's policy was that one person was supposed to remain with at least 1 farm. That was the initial approach, the initial thrust of government. But still that did not work. Government went to court to try and seek recourse to redistribute land in Zimbabwe. Because you must look at this from a moral point of view. Again, that did not succeed. So black people went onto farms to occupy them in a demonstration, with coming out of the frustrations emanating from the pronouncements made by Tony Blair's government that there was not going to be any funding for this process. And in that process, of course, it's unfortunate that there was a bit of violence to it. Some people may have been killed. It's not on the scale as was reported by Western media. You must understand that a certain of members of even of House of Commons had land in Zimbabwe, which land was taken back during that period of demonstration. But what is key about this process is that the property relations in Zimbabwe were being realigned. In other words, we're moving away from an unsustainable policy where 0.something% of the total population of a nation or a society own most of the productive land, and then taking that land back to the majority people that are really the rightful owners of that land.
So now all the 4,005 farmers left the country?
No. We still have plenty of white farmers in Zimbabwe. We still have white farmers farming. It's not all of the land that belonged to white people that was taken. We have some white farmers that remained in, at quite a sizable number. I don't know what figures to talk about. it also doesn't mean that a person who was removed from a farm left Zimbabwe. It doesn't mean that. Some of them emigrated into towns, some of them changed businesses, some of them acceded to the one farmer, one farm policy, and therefore continued farming.
But then when you take over the farm, and Zimbabwe was a big exporter of all of these things you mentioned, fruits, all of that, you know, a big exporter of that, very arable land, and so it was a mechanized farming process. It wasn't a crude farming process with basic implements. This was a mechanized farming process. And one needed some skill, technique, experience to be able to manage that process and continue to deliver the outcomes in terms of the fruits or whatever, deliver those outcomes for export to add to the value of the Zimbabwean economy. It would appear from what has been reported again that those who took over lack capacity. Zimbabwe now is not able to produce even 1/10 of what these 4,000 farmers were doing, and that's part of the process of the collapse of the economy because foreign exchange is not coming in as much as it did before. Is that the case there in Zimbabwe? Is it a regrettable phenomenon that the farms are really lying idle, lying fallow, and all the mechanization process is not there anymore and nothing is happening?
Okay, thank you for that important question. First, we had more fallow land during the pre-2000 era than we have now. What I'm trying to say to you is that most of the farms have been, are being utilized to productive use. Now, I want to point out from the outset on this matter that the challenge that the new farmers that were settled on these vast tracts of land have got is the issue of mechanization. Because most of these white farmers who had settled on these farms, upon leaving these farms, some of them took away their implements. Some of them vandalized their implements.
Oh, they vandalized it?
Yes.
By setting it ablaze?
Setting it ablaze or doing many sorts of things, you know, in an act of sabotage so that the land reform program would not be deemed to be successful. But let me tell you this. The land reform program in Zimbabwe is successful in more ways than one. Number one, you now have, where you had 4,000 commercial farmers, you now have close to 500,000 commercial farmers in Zimbabwe.
500,000?
Yes. You now have close to 500,000 commercial farmers.
Does it reflect in the produce?
I'm coming to that. I'm coming to that point. That is number one. Number two, where you had, we were producing tobacco, for instance, at less than 100 million kilograms of tobacco. Now Zimbabwe is producing over 300 million kilograms of tobacco. That being done by black new farmers that have been settled as a result of the land reform policy. We have a challenge in terms of producing maize, and it's not necessarily attributable to the fact of the land reform program. A number of factors militate against production of food in Zimbabwe at the present moment, in fact, in the last decade. Number one, capacity is affected by the fact that in 2001, Europe and America imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe, and therefore affecting the whole process of lines of credit, access to lines of credit, and so forth and so on, in order to fund capacity in agriculture. Number two, we have had a sustained long period of drought, which is very unusual in Zimbabwe, since really 1999. For instance, from the region where I come from, which is the southern parts of the country, we have not realized any reasonable produce since 1999 to present day. The third point...
What do you attribute that to? Weather, bad weather?
Yes, to
really?
Climatic conditions due to, according to scientists, climate change and so forth. We don't have good rains in the last 10 years. The other most important thing that I want to point out to you, Paul, is that it's not true that most of the food that was being produced before 1999, when Zimbabwe was referred to as the bread basket of Africa, was coming from commercial farmland. That's not true. That's not a fact. Most
really?
of that food, yes, most of that food was actually produced by farmers. President Robert Mugabe, upon coming to power in 1980, introduced an aggressive agricultural policy which integrated communal farming as an integral part of the national agricultural system and enabled communal farmers to be able to produce food. So 80% of maize, for instance, produced in Zimbabwe in the pre-2000 era was coming from communal farmers as opposed to commercial farmers, the white commercial farmers. So this is the point.
Mm. That's interesting. So what were the white farmers producing? With the mechanization that they had, they were strong on mechanization. What were they producing?
Most white farmers, realizing the drop in prices of food crops, had already migrated as at 2000 away from production of maize, away from production of sorghum, away from production of most of these food crops to tobacco. Remember, Zimbabwe is a major producer of tobacco. So they moved away from food crops to cash crops so that they would realize a lot of profit coming out of their work. The farmers that we're talking about, the settler farmers of pre-2000 era, were very rich farmers. In Zimbabwe, if one was a farmer, he was a very rich person. And this is attributable to the fact that they were producing tobacco and other cash crops away from food production.
So in terms of the export volumes of Zimbabwe, is it better now? You talked about tobacco, we understand that. But is it better now generally?
Yes, tobacco is better. It's earning much more than it used to do in the pre-2000 era. It's earning much more. The volumes in terms of production have increased. I just gave you the figures from 100 million kilograms per annum to over 300 million kilograms per annum of production in terms of tobacco. Now, we do some kind of processing of tobacco, but most of it is exported.
So why did the economy come on its knees? The picture you're painting means that there was a quick sort of swap and production capacities were sustained. Production was still ongoing. That in fact, the critical things that Zimbabwe was exporting was being done by black farmers and they were still there. Why did the economy come on its knees so that inflation was 4,000%?
Yes, the production that was coming from the communal farmers was not meant for export. That is important for me to point out.
Okay.
What the communal farmers were doing was to produce food for the country. Now, why did the economy collapse in Zimbabwe? The economy collapsed because when the land reform program was introduced in Zimbabwe, the response from Europe, the response from the United States of America, working in cahoots with Europe, was to impose crippling sanctions. There's a guy called Chester Crocker in the US government at that time who made the infamous statement that they were going to make Zimbabwe's economy scream and politicians in Zimbabwe were going to be bent in the streets. Well, the economy did scream, but no politician was bent in the streets because of the resilience of the Zimbabwean people, because of the resilience even of the Zimbabwean economy. Now, I want to point out that the sanctions that Europe imposed, for instance, the sanctions that the Zimbabwe Democratic and Economic Recovery Act of the US imposed on Zimbabwe, did affect in a big way productive capacity. Because it means that the companies that were producing in the manufacturing sector could no longer access lines of credit from international financial institutions. We could no longer deal with the World Bank. We could no longer deal with the IMF. But beyond that, the banks in Zimbabwe had sanctions imposed upon them, which means that they could not do international transactions and so forth and so on. State companies, state parastatals could no longer be able to access lines of credit. This, in a big way, affected the Zimbabwe.
Was it really sanctions or it was restrictions? Okay,
it's sanctions. But what the PR machine in Europe packaged it as is that there are restrictive measures for Zimbabwean politicians, ZANU-PF politicians, not to travel into Europe. Europe imposed two sets of sanctions on Zimbabwe. Number one, Zimbabwean politicians could not travel into Europe. That's one thing. Mm-hmm. But that should not affect the economy. We are not even bothered about that. Mm-hmm. We are not even worried about that, mm-hmm. right? Except for bilateral reasons with Britain and other countries. Yeah. If it's up to them if they want to lift those travel restrictions. We are not even bothered.
Are they still in place, the travel restrictions?
Come again?
Are the travel restrictions still in place?
They've been lifting them slowly. Now there are 10 people that are left on the travel restrictions list.
Oh, it's individuals?
Yes.
It includes President Mugabe?
Correct. But I want to come to the point that apart from the travel restrictions list, they also imposed economic sanctions under Article 96 of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement of the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly. So those economic sanctions, for instance, suspended Zimbabwe's signature to the European Development Fund. It means whereas other ACP countries were benefiting from the European Development Fund, Zimbabwe was no longer going to be benefiting from that. It suspended funding for animal husbandry in Zimbabwe. That means that agriculture was affected. It suspended assistance to education. That means education was affected. It suspended budget support. So Zimbabwe, for the last 12 years, It has been going on by itself without any budget support, without any form of support from Europe. This is the effect of the economic sanctions. So there are two sets, the travel restrictions and the economic sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe. And on account of these economic sanctions, our economy went down.
That's interesting. That's a new dimension I'm hearing. That was on account of the sanctions, restrictions to do business with the rest of the world in this globalized world. Yes. Naturally, the economy is going to crash. Correct. Banks cannot do their correspondence. Correct. With other corresponding banks. Everything is stopped, etc., etc. Yes. Where are we now on the lifting process of the sanctions? You told us about the travel arrangements where you say that with 10 people are still on. President Mugabe and 9 others maybe. Where are we in the rest of the restrictions on financial institutions particularly? It's of interest to me.
Our attitude to Europe is that first and foremost, these sanctions were not warranted. Zimbabweans were taking back their land. So you cannot punish a people for reclaiming what is rightfully theirs. That is number one. And therefore, any process of lifting sanctions should be unconditional. And this idea that you lift sanctions, you lift travel restrictions on one group of people and you leave the other is really just meant to divide, the ZANU-PF membership. And we can see through this. We think that we don't accept it. We don't accept the status quo. What Europe should do is to lift the travel restrictions on all of the politicians. Imagine a government that has been functioning for the last 5 years. Half of that government has travel restrictions. Half of that government...
Your foreign minister could not travel?
Yes. Foreign minister used to be on the travel restrictions list. He's one of the ministers that was removed in another tranche of the removal process. But we think that that should not be the case. How does a government function when half of that government is sanctions imposed on it and half of the other government is free to do whatever it wants? This is the problem.
That's really interesting. So how do you see the new relationship developing between Harare and, say, London, and yes. Harare and Washington?
Yes, it's interesting. Let me speak to the issue of Harare and London. It's interesting that we just 2 weeks ago, London has activated a political dialogue, a re-engagement process with Harare. In fact, as I speak last week, our re-engagement team traveled to London to engage with the British government on establishing full bilateral relations, which, of course, they were there, but very, very frosty, as you may be aware. So that is a discussion that is going on. We are yet to see what is going to come out of it. It's very interesting that the British are the ones that have initiated this process. In terms of the diplomatic relationship between Zimbabwe and London, the diplomatic relationship between Zimbabwe and Brussels, we are going to see an improvement if this discussion that is going on between London and Harare is concluded.
When will it be concluded?
We don't know yet.
Let's move up to Kenya, yes, where there's a historical issue of land reforms as well, but that may have been at the back of the minds of people in this election that was fought. 2 young men, Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, have now been confirmed as winners of the election, including by the court. They will be the 2 youngest pair of African leaders, I believe, in terms of the pair, when they meet next at the African Union on the 50th anniversary, incidentally, of the African Union in May in Addis Ababa. Looking at the Kenyan situation, these 2 men have also been charged at the International Criminal Court. Do you think there's an imperialist hand working in Kenya, and can it be seen in the politics of Nairobi? Thank you.
Kenya is a very interesting scenario. First, I want you to know that I for one, and I believe I speak for many citizens of the world, celebrate the winning of Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto in Kenya. In that, what it has done is to represent the dismantling of the vestigial colonial apparatus, which was expressing itself in the politics of Kenya through Prime Minister Raila Odinga then, and trying to set up an outpost in Harare through the politics of the MDC in a very intravenous way, not even an ambiguous way, very intravenous way. So I celebrate the defeat of imperialism in Nairobi, and of course in Africa. I celebrate the defeat of neocolonialism. I celebrate the winning of a Pan-African in Kenya. This, for me, is very, very important. Now, you ask me whether I see the workings of a colonial hand in the politics of Kenya. Yes, I do. First and foremost, former Prime Minister Raila Odinga never hid his allegiance to Western, the Western influence. This is something that he never tried to disguise. It was clear that whatever he was doing, he was doing it at the behest of the West. He was doing it at the behest of the North. And thank God, Kenyans got fed up with this, and he was defeated at the election. Now, you want to understand the issue of the ICC. I think that the ICC is a court that has been set up to deal with African politicians. That's what I think. Of course, I know that from Eastern Europe, there are a couple of politicians that have been taken to that court. But by and large...
The ICC is interesting. Let me take a break. We'll come back and pick it up from the ICC. And I hope you are enjoying your program and you have your notes, pen and paper. If you're students, you're beginning to understand Zimbabwe, and we are now going to understand a little bit about the Kenyan politics. But I guess that you've understood the Zimbabwe situation, at least from the perspective of our guest, Honourable Makhosini. You can read a bit more about that and get some new perspectives. But I'm sure that you're enjoying it, and I'll be delighted if you are. After the break, we'll pick it up from the ICC in Kenya, and then I'll be asking him later on that President Robert Mugabe has gone past his best. Why should people like him, young man in parliament, be backing President Robert Mugabe at this time in Africa's renaissance? We are talking about William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta. Why does he support Robert Mugabe? I'll be back. Yeah, we'll finish. Welcome back to the show, and this is the last lap of tonight's edition of the program. Honourable Makhosini is with me. He is a member of parliament in Zimbabwe with ZANU-PF party, the party that has ruled Zimbabwe from independence in 1980. Is the party of Robert Mugabe. You were telling us about the ICC, and you're worried with the way in which the processing of Uhuru and William Ruto. We're not so sure yet, now that they will be sworn in as president and vice, whether they will still, as sovereign leaders, appear before the ICC for crimes allegedly committed in 2007 elections. But we'll get to that in a bit. Tell us about the ICC.
I'm worried with an international justice system that segregates against other nations, that segregates against certain pockets of peoples in this global community. You have a Rome statute that is not recognized by way of signing onto it by all the countries. But you have people that are most vocal about taking politicians to the ICC who are themselves not signatories to the Rome statute. That is a contradiction in terms.
You are referring to Washington?
I'm referring to Washington. I'm referring to, yes, to Washington is especially, right? Zimbabweans, for instance, Africans, Kenyans, Sudanese, and all that, they are supposed to be taking their politicians to The Hague. But the crimes of war committed in Iraq, for which all media now is reporting that whatever happened that led to the war of in Iraq was a lie. There's no one who is taken to The Hague to account for their deeds in Iraq. No one is taken there to account. So a justice system that is not recognized by all and sundry is no longer a justice system. The rules must apply to everybody equally. So what I think should happen is that the Kenyans must develop their internal justice system to an extent that they're able to process whatever crimes are alleged to have been committed by President-elect Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto and all their alleged accomplices. It is important. And this is very revealing for African governments, that we need to begin to develop the capacity of our juridical systems in order to be able to process our own issues without necessarily having to refer to The Hague or to other jurisdictions.
Do you think that Uhuru will appear before the court? Do you think he should? Do you think the court should cancel the decision? We know that there are diplomatic overtures apparently being made to Uhuru and William Ruto now from the north. Do you think they will go, they should go? What's your view on that?
Well, according to what Uhuru has consistently said, is that he's going to appear before the court. That he has consistently mentioned all the time about the ICC. Now, the diplomatic overtures that are coming from the north, reaching out to Uhuru, are important. I think Kenya is an important economy. I think Kenya is an important border polity that the West would want to engage in a very serious way. And to have a president who is hamstrung by a juridical process somewhere in lands far away, and you expect them to be able to deliver in their own country in terms of the mandate that they've been given is a bit unfair on Uhuru. So I think what should happen is that since the other case has been dropped on one of the accomplices, Uhuru Kenyatta should be let loose, William Ruto should be let loose, they should be processed internally in Kenya. They should appear before the High Court of Kenya or the Supreme Court of Kenya or whatever, Constitutional Court of Kenya. I don't know what courts they have in Kenya to deal with these matters and bring these issues to a close, as opposed to a situation where they have to be taken to The Hague.
Before we talk about Mugabe, just so that I don't forget, Johannesburg and South Africa is important in the geopolitics of Zimbabwe.
Yes.
And President Jacob Zuma was one of the foremost supporters of Robert Mugabe in the crisis period.
Yes.
I mean President Mbeki,
yes.
Thabo Mbeki.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure whether Jacob Zuma is keeping with that as well. But how do you see the dynamics of South African politics? We know of Julius Malema and the crisis of the African National Congress. Do you think, going forward in South African politics, that the African National Congress may be threatened with a split? If it is, will that affect the stability of the geopolitics in Southern Africa?
Okay. I don't think that the ANC at this present moment is threatened with any split. It already has suffered one, when former President Thabo Mbeki was ousted at in Limpopo, in Polokwane. Now, the ANC has just gone through a very important elective conference in which President Zuma was retained. We saw a gracious acceptance of defeat by those that were contesting the various positions. We saw a gracious reciprocation from President Zuma that those that had contested whatever positions were going to be retained in their positions in government. And that, for me, cements the relationship. That internal democratic process is very important in terms of allowing the ANC to be able to go on with its internal debate and strengthening of its internal democratic processes. So I don't see any splitting of the ANC. The ANC has a very robust internal debate as part of its democratic culture, and this is very, very important. Now, I need to state here that President Zuma has been doing some good work in terms of facilitating, the dialogue in Zimbabwe, making sure that the different political parties come together on various issues which they could not come together on, before the dialogue process began. So he's doing, South Africa is very important in Southern Africa in terms of the geopolitical, strategic, imperative. It is very, very important. It is the biggest economy, not only in Southern Africa, but on the African continent. It is one of the biggest countries in Southern Africa. It's a very, very important strategic neighbor, especially to us as Zimbabwe.
And you're confident that things will be fine there?
Yes.
Let me come to the final question for this interview, and it's about old man Robert Mugabe. Yes. And he's our brother-in-law here in Ghana because his first wife, Sally, was from Ghana. So we do love him very much. But as a political scientist and observing the African politics, there could be some ink of discredit that could be spilled on a paper with the headline Robert Mugabe and Zimbabwe. It is expected that he will be exiting power at about this time. But what is more worrying for some observers is the kind of endorsement that Mugabe receives from politicians like you, who will be expected to chart a new course for the new Zimbabwe. And here you are backing and singing songs in praise of this leader who was a great leader by all standards, but who may not be so great now looking at the history of the recent past. Why do you back Mugabe?
Thank you very much. That's a very revealing question. President Mugabe is not a president who was great and is no longer great. Now, that is not a correct narrative of describing President Robert Mugabe. President Mugabe was great in terms of leading the liberation struggle. President Mugabe was great in terms of championing the dawn of independence. President Mugabe was great in terms of leading the first political dispensation post-independence. But President Mugabe is still great because of the work that he has continued to do in our country. Now, why is that so? Because President Mugabe represents everything you call empowerment in Zimbabwe, and indeed to the continent. President Mugabe represents everything you want to call empowerment. First, political empowerment. He led Zimbabwe to the independence war that then brought about independence in 1980. So we are free as Zimbabweans today, which were not, under the apartheid state of Ian Smith. So we are free as Zimbabweans. We have a multi-party state. We have several political actors with diverse opinion, things that we could not do before 1980. So that is the first level of empowerment. The second level of empowerment that President Robert Mugabe was brought about is the realignment of property relations in Zimbabwe. This is the land reform program. In Zimbabwe, we call it the second Chimrenga. In other words, the second war, the second liberation war. In fact, the third Chimrenga, the third liberation war. After the first Chimrenga of the 1890s, the second Chimrenga, which he led together.
What's the word Chimrenga?
The word Chimrenga means a liberation war.
Chimurenga.
Yes, Chimurenga.
Liberation War.
Liberation War.
We had that in Ghana too.
Yes.
We didn't take guns, but we went through something like that.
Okay,
yes.
fine.
So Chimurenga.
Chimurenga, yes.
Okay.
So the third Chimurenga is the Chimurenga of property realignment in Zimbabwe. You must understand how much of an empowerment this is. I just spoke to you about output in terms of tobacco production in Zimbabwe from slightly over 100 million kilograms per annum to well over 300 million kilograms of output per annum, now being done by a black person, on land that he was given, on land that was allocated to him in the land reform program. Now, we are talking of close to 500,000 farmers. What does it do to them in terms of social mobility? It definitely lifts them from the doldrums of poverty and leaves them at a certain level. These various smallholder farms, these various small farms that were demarcated and allocated to the black people upon which they are producing this tobacco, coming together to a yield of over 300 million means that there is a lot of money that is going down into the black farmer. That is the third aspect of empowerment. The fourth aspect of empowerment is what is currently going on now. Zimbabwe is endowed with a rich mineral base, a rich mineral resource. And the president has just, for the past 3-4 years, he has made clear the pronouncement that all big mining companies, especially white capital that comes into Zimbabwe, must make sure that 49% of that shareholding goes to black Zimbabweans. Because his argument is that that which is taken from the belly of the earth cannot come back. It cannot be reinvested. So it means that most of that money has to remain in Zimbabwe. So you have young Zimbabweans now participating in mining as far as gold is concerned, as far as platinum is concerned, as far as diamonds are concerned. They are participating in every mineral in terms of mining in Zimbabwe as a result of the empowerment process of President Robert Mugabe. This is an important foundational work, Paul, that the president has been engaged on from independence up to now. And this is something that we cannot ignore. This is something that is worth celebrating. This is the reason why young politicians in Zimbabwe, young people in Zimbabwe, even those that are not politicians, young urbanites in Zimbabwe love President Robert Mugabe.
Wow. That's a very powerful sort of statement. But what about the violence? What about the families who remember their people who were killed? Mm-hmm. Zimbabwe was so peaceful.
Yes.
What about those who said that 1999, they remember the year, they cursed the year 1999, they cursed the year 2000, and they cursed the name of Robert Mugabe because their family people died?
Excellent. You raise an important question. But the same people must also curse the year 1976. They must also curse the year 1979, when Ian Smith went into Mozambique and bombed and killed in one incident 6,000 black Zimbabweans that were fighting to liberate their own country. The same people must also curse Ian Smith for leading a raid in bases in Zambia, where Joshua Nkomo's Zipra was operating from, and killing not less than 2,000 people in one operation. The same people must also curse those kind of operations. Let me tell you about this President Robert Mugabe. In 1980, notwithstanding that level of violence, wanton violence and destruction, he pronounced a policy of reconciliation. And he said, let us turn our swords into plowshares. We are not going to fight anybody. And of course, Ian Smith died in Cape Town, not in exile. Having gone there on his own accord, he was allowed to live freely in Zimbabwe. He was never arrested. He had the freedom to do the kind of things that he never allowed black people in Zimbabwe to do. So this is the basis upon any form of violence in Zimbabwe was built. And I think that part of the mistake that we made in Zimbabwe is that we did not engage in a national healing process immediately after independence in order to bring about the warring factions, to discuss openly the issues that were happening during the Liberation War, to try to find a way of compensating, not necessarily with money, but with a pardon, with a forgiveness from those that were participating, from the wrong side of the liberation struggle.
Good luck, Honourable Makhosini. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you again at the top of Zimbabwe.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Good night, viewers. Bye.